Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Elixir Mix. This week on our panel, we have Mark Ericksen.
Hey there.
Josh Adams.
Hi.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Bill Peregoy. Bill, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
And do you want to give us just a brief introduction, who you are, why you're famous, all that stuff?
I'm not sure I'm very famous, but anyway, here goes. I've been have a kind of diverse background. I did many years of hardware design. I was designing computer chips for many years, kind of gravitated more towards the software process tool side of things, and really got into Ruby from that because I found it just to be a great scripting environment and also a more powerful language than something like Perl. From there, I moved actually fully into the software world. Spent some time at Constant Contact doing working on a big Ruby project. And over that time, I discovered the first Elixir book from Dave Thomas and was fascinated by Elixir, didn't completely understand the concepts, but really thought it was a cool thing and wanted to know more about it. About a year ago, I took a job with the NAR Company. We're a consulting firm out of Boston doing consulting for various clients. A lot of the work's in Ruby, but we have a few Elixir projects. And I had the pleasure of being put on an Elixir project working for the Boston MBTA. They have a really cool, small entrepreneurial group that's doing all the new software for the MBTA in Elixir. So I spent about 9 months working on their website, which is really cool. And then about 3 months ago, I transferred to a new project where I'm working for a company called TradeHounds, and we're building a social media platform for construction workers and other craftspeople. It's kind of an Instagram for that sort of thing.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, it's been fun.
So I had to look it up. The MBTA, I think, is this the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority?
Yeah, it's basically our mass transit organization, which you think of as being an old, crusty, using 40-year-old technology kind of group. And it is in a lot of ways, but they built a small group that's building out new features in Elixir with agile technologies, and we're getting stuff done. We got stuff done really fast there. So it's been fun.
Nice. You mentioned you had this hardware background. I'm just curious if you'd had a chance to at least look at Nerves as something that you'd be interested in.
I looked at it a little bit. I have a whole pile of Raspberry Pis waiting for some fancy Gen server or Nerves project, but of course they're sitting there gathering dust while I do other things. But I do have an interest in going into that, but haven't done anything more than peruse the top level docs.
Nice.
Very cool. Well, yeah, we brought you on to talk about basically deploying Elixir apps, but it sounds like as we were getting ready to start the show that getting into Elixir might be a little bit more interesting way of hitting this, and then we can talk about the deployment as part of that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So what was your experience getting into Elixir?
Well, my experience, I had a pretty easy slide into Elixir when I was working for the MBTA. That's a larger project, a lot of engineers, and they had the ability to onboard me pretty slowly to Elixir. I had some Elixir experience, but hadn't written code for pay yet. And, being a larger project, they could, throw out small features and give me bigger features as time went on. So I got a really good idea of how to write Elixir features, how to structure code, how to build Elixir data structures, and got really awesome code review, which grew me as an engineer quite a bit. And a lot of my MPEX talk was about that experience of learning to write code in better ways, more Elixir way. So that was a really nice onboard for me.
Where do you think you would have run into trouble if you hadn't had that kind of...
I think coming from an OOP kind of background, how do you organize code? Because code is just in Elixir, it's just a bunch of modules with functions in them. How do you organize those functions in a way that makes them make sense to somebody else? And the whole idea of organize them around data types. You have a data type that has some structure associated with it, and you define all the functions that use that structure in that module. and kind of build your thing up that way. So it's sort of like objects, but not really objects. It's just data with functions that operate on that data. And that really helped me a lot, because before it was like, it could go over here, it could go over here. And I got really clear ideas on where code goes from that.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned getting code reviews, and like that to me is just such a good way to learn something new fast and like get to skip a lot of the hurdles.
Yeah, the MBTA is lucky to have a lead engineer there that is very picky about code reviews, to the point of annoying me at times. But in the end, he's always right, of course. People aren't always right. But he was a really good guy, and his code reviews were great. They were detailed, and every time he read my code, I learned a lot and said, oh, that's why I do it that way. So I was really, really happy to have that.
I'm just curious, as someone who I give code reviews as well, like from the receiver, like the Elixir Junior kind of perspective, what makes for giving a good code review? As the receiver of it, what makes a good code review?
I think it's really the combination of explaining, here's why I wouldn't structure it that way, and here's a little example of how I might structure it without giving me the answer. Don't write the code for me, but give me an idea. Here's the reason I'd like you to do it differently. Here's a general direction. Go off and do that. And that's really helpful. It may take more iterations than just saying, do it this way, but you grow the engineer a lot quicker that way than just saying, here's the answer. Making mistakes as you go along is really a good thing.
Yeah, I like that.
The way I go about that is I give the person I'm reviewing, I give them some sample code, but it doesn't work at all. And that way they can't use my sample code because it's got all the bugs. So they have to learn the stuff.
I do that all the time, but it's not on purpose. I think it's working. I'm like, hey, this doesn't work.
I might have been joking.
Yeah, I've been there too. So do you think it helped that it was such a large project, or would it have been easier to pick up on a smaller project?
I think the fact that it was a fairly large project and had a lot of structure to it. We had a really good agile process, so it was easy to pick tickets that were well defined, versus on a smaller project that may have been moving at a higher velocity. Tickets would have been less defined, and I would have been struggling with two things at once. One, trying to define what do they really want here. Second, how do I do this in this brand new language today?
Right. So, we have a little bit of information here about deployment, and we've talked about deployment and Distillery and some of the tools that you use for some of this stuff. But what I'm curious about is, in your particular case, you were deploying to AWS and ECS. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like a lot of times we're talking about deploying to like some virtual server system, or maybe to Heroku where it's just a git push. And it seems like this is a little bit more involved.
Yeah, this was kind of a wild ride for me. We really wanted to deploy to AWS because we wanted to just get there early. We knew we'd have to go there eventually, that Heroku wasn't going to be enough long term. So we just bit the bullet and went for it. And none of us had ever deployed an Elixir Phoenix app before. And I happened upon, and I also had very little experience with AWS. I had played with AWS, never done anything with containers on AWS. So there was thousands of new things I was learning in basically 1 week. And I happened upon this really good guy, which we should probably link to in the show notes. Someone named Joachim Duraz, probably pronouncing that name all wrong, had this really great guide that I followed. And it went from ground zero, working up to, let's first build your app. Let's first get it running in production mode. Make sure you can set up all the configs to run in production mode. It runs. Let's take that production app and connect it to an external database on RDS. Make sure that works. Then let's Dockerize it, make sure that works. And then finally getting to the point where once you're at Dockerize, running locally under Docker, setting up the AWS infrastructure and pushing to that. So there's a lot going on there, but by breaking it down to those discrete pieces, you could actually debug the problems when they came up. And there were many problems.
I like it.
Yeah, I really was a lifesaver having Joachim's work to go off of, because it would have taken me weeks instead of like 3 days to get this done.
Well, and it reminds me,
is a very comprehensive guide.
Yeah, my wife and I watched The Martian a couple nights ago, and together, just an evening together. And it was interesting because at the end of the movie, Mark Watney, character from The Martian, he basically said, "Yeah, what you wind up doing is just solving one problem at a time."
Exactly, and that's the key. If you try to solve multiples at one time, you may solve it, but you won't really know how you did it, because you'll change a variable and things will break again. Where building that base and keep building upon it is the way to get things done.
Yeah, I've been just looking at this link to this article for guide to deploying Elixir Phoenix apps to AWS ECS. This is the one you're talking about from Joachim.
Right.
I think it's this is a really comprehensive. I wish I'd seen this a long time ago.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. It just was a beautiful thing because it gave me all the directions to try to do it, but by doing it step by step, I understood the pieces fairly well. And then when something broke, I was debugging a small piece versus a big piece.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that in this guide, they're talking about setting up as an umbrella project using like separating the web interface from the business logic interface. At least I think that's how I read it. I was just wondering if that's how you guys have your project set up as an umbrella, or if it's a single Phoenix app, or how do you have it?
I have a single Phoenix app for this Trade Hounds project. Previously at the MBTA, we had a very large umbrella project where the website itself probably was an umbrella of 7 or 8 different applications. And that was a much bigger application. This was fairly small. It's tiny, but it's a fairly small CRUD app. And it seemed overkill to break that into umbrellas at this point.
Yeah.
But I did find adapting from the umbrella to a smaller non-umbrella was very easy with this guide. I think there was one change in the Docker file.
So is there anything that you learned along the way that surprised you? Like, it sounds like you were learning a lot of different technologies as you went through this. Like, is there any I don't know, big ahas or anything like that you came across?
I think the big aha for me was the fact that, I hadn't deployed anything that was a compiled language in a long time, since old C days, and understanding that you could build this container. To build using Distillery, you need everything. You need Elixir, Erlang, and so forth to build. But then when you actually deploy, you can deploy it from a much smaller container, just containing Alpine and the output of Distillery. So it was kind of cool to see that I could build this giant thing, which had all these dependencies that weren't needed for running it, and get rid of those before I actually deployed the real thing. So the package you're deploying is tiny, and any potential security holes from all that extra software go away. So that was kind of the big aha moment I had. Like, wow, you don't have to have all that stuff around.
Yeah, that is really neat. I do like how the Distillery 2.0 guide and the Docker file is set up with that 2-stage process, and you end up with this really tiny Alpine, deliverable. I think that's a great pattern.
Yep.
Do you want to walk us through the basic structure of your MPEX talk?
Yeah, I was talking on that talk about using higher order functions. That's something you get used to when you're working in an object-oriented language, of using duck typing and have classes that use some sort of inheritance or something to reuse data. Where in the Elixir world, you want to pass around functions. So the whole idea was I had this one task I had to do that was very similar, but you had to do it multiple times. And the data types I was operating were slightly different for each one. So to do that, I ended up, defining one piece of code that actually did the process end to end of the transformation I was trying to make. And then I passed in the functions to operate on the different data types in the different areas. So it was a way to reuse a lot of code and just have very small functions that did the access to the individual data structures for each different type of data. And that had great implications for doing tests as well, because of course with tests you can do sort of what you consider mocking in other languages by passing in a very trivial function, test the algorithm with that trivial function, and be done with testing there.
That's actually a pattern I enjoy using as well for building systems that talk to external services. I like the idea of, instead of using like a mocking library, I like having like a function that can kind of direct it to go, oh, well, because of the data, I know that this is going to my test interface. And because of the data, I know this is going to my live interface. And I can say, well, in test mode, we're always going to make it always go to the test interface. But the idea, I guess, that I really enjoyed about it is that it allowed me to have test data and a test interface in a production environment. So I could create a customer that is a test mode customer, and they could be actively hitting these mocked out services in a production setting. And I really like that because it let me have all the canned responses I wanted. If I wanted to emulate that a connection fails or a DNS lookup fails, or that I'm getting bad data in response, I could simulate all of that. So yeah, I love those. Just really it's just with higher order functions and just kind of swapping out where they point.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. I'm doing that right now. I have a GenStage where I'm doing some batch processing of photos. And at the very top level, when I pass state into my Gen server / GenStage, I pass in the function that says, here's what I want to do with this batch processor. And when I'm testing it, I pass in something that basically does nothing. It just does a short sleep or something simpler like that. When I'm running the real application, I pass in this real function that does very complex image processing, uploading to S3 and all sorts of things like that. And it's very nice to be able to test the GenStage functionality outside of the testing of the actual big thing I'm doing with GenStage.
So I'm pretty new. What is GenStage?
GenStage is pretty awesome. GenStage is kind of, it's not in Elixir Proper yet. It's kind of a superset of GenServer, where GenServer allows you to spin up a process and send messages to it, modify state, get things back. GenStage allows you to take multiple GenServer type things and link them together to process data in a pipeline. So you can have one consumer that asks for data from the next stage, and you can say, give me no more than this much at a time. The producer will send data as they have it back, and all the handshaking and the back pressure is done automatically through GenStage. You just write the functions, connect it, tell it very simply, here's the maximum data I can take at a time. And I'm using that a lot for, I have like my producer is basically a queue, and my consumer is this processor that actually processes photos.
That sounds awesome.
It's really cool because all the corner cases you'd run into when dealing with back pressure and things like that are handled automatically, and you just write the real logic and leave GenStage to do the hard stuff.
Nice. Yeah. I can definitely see where that's helpful because, I mean, I've set things up with queuing before, primarily in Ruby on Rails. And yeah, you have to manage the pipeline on your own. And so it's, go do a whole bunch of these and then do a whole bunch of those. And you have different workers that do different parts of the process, but you've got to manage the process of passing it on to the next stage.
Yeah, and the really cool thing is you can make this as many stages as you want and do fairly complex things. Say you have some service out there you want to upload to, but it has some rate limiting on it. You can only upload so many per minute. Mm-hmm. You can set up a service that has that kind of constraint on it and say, don't give me more than this much because I know the person I'm talking to can't take that much. Right. And that can all be handled behind the scenes versus the funny handshaking with the third-party service.
Yeah, I've used that pattern before, and I really do like that. Like it's a situation I had was like, the first stage was kind of the queue, just manage the queue, and then you had worker pool. And so we had this situation where we were talking to an external service, and they, like, for one of our requests, it could take like 6 to 7 seconds for them to respond. And so we were just trying to rate limit ourselves. And so that we weren't just like, when we do a batch job, we don't just flood them with all this traffic and they just fall over. So it was more of a, we're going to create, have our queue so we can just fire up all these, batch jobs, and they throw all this work into the queue. And then you have, like, we say, well, we want 6 active workers, and they're just pulling the data. And we just set that one up where, you mentioned, Bill, how you can, they can say, well, only give me this much at a time. In that case, I just said, we'll just take one at a time because each one is so expensive in time to process. So it's just pull one out and then send the requests out.
And that's what I'm doing right now for my image processing processor. I'm just taking one at a time right now. But the cool thing about using GenStage is if I decide, I'm getting more processing than I need on this one node, I can spin up multiple versions of this processor and have them run in parallel. And those things are not using much CPU because they're mostly talking to external services. So like it's probably just spin up, multiples on one node. And if I need more processing power, it's really a one-liner in my code right now to spin up another one.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that sort of thing is when Elixir feels very powerful, the actual infrastructure around OTP things.
Yeah, I think that's one of those talks I have a lot is, why would I choose Elixir over Rails? Because we work in a company with a lot of Rails programmers, and Rails is great. Probably easier to bring up this kind of API in Rails versus Elixir. But I think where the power of Elixir comes in is when you start diving into OTP and just need the raw speed of Elixir. The OTP, I think, is the game changer when you start playing with Elixir.
Well, and the Ruby ecosystem's a lot more mature. And so, we're starting to get there, with Elixir. I feel like a lot of the things that, I don't miss as much stuff from Ruby when I'm working on it as I did a couple of years ago when I tried it.
Yeah, that was one of my bigger fears starting this project, this newer one in Elixir, was what libraries I don't know I need yet, but I'll need and be sorry I don't have. And so far, I haven't come across that. A lot of my work is communicating with AWS, and there are pretty good EX AWS libraries out there. The thing I'm finding is they're not as documented as well as the Ruby ones, so I'll occasionally find myself going back, reading Ruby documentation for their Elixir AWS library and translating that into the same function calls on the Elixir side. And that's been very useful, so I thank the Ruby community for their awesome documentation.
Interesting.
Have you used GenState for anything other than the image processing system?
That's all I've done so far. It was used at the MBTA for some fairly complex stuff. I wasn't directly involved in those projects, but they did some really cool stuff where they're doing predictions for subway and bus lines. And they grab data from many, many sources. There's third-party prediction sources, our internal API, and so forth. And they're trying to combine all that data. And that's been a perfect solution with GenState for them. Don't know a whole lot of details, but it's really been a great way. And they've been very happy with GenState for solving that problem.
That sounds like a great use case.
So since you've come from a Ruby background and even dealing with hardware, what has your experience been with the stability of the Elixir ecosystem? Just like the stability of the projects, the code, or any of that?
It's really been rock solid for me. I've had very few problems with it. And the one thing I've come to really appreciate about Elixir, and I guess it's functional programming in general, is the languages tend to be smaller. Well, one thing I like about Elixir, a new Elixir release, there's almost nothing new in it every time, which some people get upset. I mean, I think people that are coming from a JavaScript world are like, I need new stuff every time. I'm addicted to new stuff. But Elixir is like, the language is kind of done. We're just adding a few bells and whistles, and we don't need that many. So we're not crazy about making the language more complex.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. And let's see, Jose Valim, he kind of talked about that at the latest ElixirConf 2018, where he's basically saying that a lot of the exciting exploratory stuff is happening outside, like GenState, how that is not part of the language itself. That is one of those libraries in the ecosystem that's available, but that in many regards, Elixir is a very mature platform right now, and all of the experimentation stuff that may or may not ever come into Elixir, but that's like flourishing in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's been really good that somehow Elixir has done that, not pull a ton of stuff in, but generally have not 10 ways of doing everything. I think it's a sign of the maturity of the community that people haven't felt the need to go and reinvent something that's 10% different from something else just because they want to invent something. They've been happy to use what's there and contribute to that piece versus inventing something new. I found that really refreshing.
Yeah, and I do think that those libraries and parts of the system that are built with care and kind of consideration, that they are very extensible. So like when you talk about like these libraries that are built in other ecosystems because, I just want it to work like this a little bit different. It's like, well, these are very extensible pieces. You can just make it work that way with this one existing library. So I love that.
Yeah, for me, that's one of the real joys of diving into Elixir is if I do have a problem, I have very little fear of diving into source code. If I can't figure something out, like these AWS libraries that aren't very well documented, diving into the source code, I can spend 20 minutes in the source code and know exactly what I need. Documentation will be nice, but the fact that I can dive in there means it's okay. Where in some Ruby libraries, they're so heavily dependent upon metaprogramming, you can't dive in and figure something out in 15 minutes. You've got to understand much more context to make a small change than in this more functional world.
For you, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
Yeah, I agree. A whole lot there. Like you literally are just following functions. There's not some lurky state that changes something.
Well, and that was something that I ran into playing with Phoenix a bit, was that there were certain things that were much more explicit. It felt a little more boilerplatey in some ways. I don't think that's a word, but you all know what I mean. But at the same time, it was like, I know it's there because it's explicitly called out. And in other ways, it was, it was more explicit in the way that I had to declare things and put things together. And Ruby and Rails have a ton of magic in them.
Yeah, I think boilerplate gets a bad name. It's, lines of code is one way of deciding what's good and what's bad. But if I write a little more code, but it's more explicit and I can still get away without repeating myself, I'm pretty happy with that extra code. I don't mind it.
Yeah, being able to be explicit and concise at the same time is what makes it not feel bad.
Exactly.
Yeah, mostly what I ran into was, import this module, import this other module. And I want to know those are there, right? So that wasn't too much of a stretch. If it was, you have to go through all this ceremony to set up some controller action or some function on a module or something like that, that's boilerplate that I don't feel like adds a lot.
Yeah,
When we're talking about explicitly saying, I'm using this, so bring it in. Or, I'm doing this thing and I don't want any hand-wavy weird stuff to go on that I can't track. The functional programming aspects of those are really nice.
Yeah, I was going to say, fundamentally, I really enjoyed monkey patching in Ruby, but getting out into a functional language, I realized it's a Band-Aid over object, really. Like being able to look at a module and say, hey, this contains every possible path to any code I can run is pretty nice, rather than, well, maybe somebody in an initializer monkey patch null toString.
Yeah, I think there's a common pattern. Ruby is really, really cool. You discover monkey patching and you see the beauty of some of the stuff in Rails done with monkey patching and you want to do it yourself. And then you usually regret 70% of that in 2 years when you look back at your old code. And now I'm much happier having to pass things in where I need them. I mean, one of the key Rails things is having your controller variables available inside your views magically. And that's kind of cool, but sometimes when I'm looking at somebody else's code, I'm like, how did that get there? And I'd rather just pass it in explicitly like we do in the views in the Phoenix world.
I did that for a bit with my Rails code and just passed assigns rather than using controller instance variables. And people got really mad. They just really did not like that it wasn't normal.
Yeah, that stuff goes well until you start making partials, and then getting things into the partials becomes you pass them into the partials, but they're automatic in the top level, and it becomes just a little bit confusing after time. Where if you just explicitly pass everything down, life just seems so much more consistent to me.
Yes, I will attest to having done the same kind of thing with metaprogramming in Ruby. Then I come to Elixir and I'm like, I'm never doing that again. And then, I come into this project where one of the developers really enjoys using macros. And that was actually the first book he read on learning Elixir was the macro programming book. And so it's been a challenge because like macros allow you to still create magic. And recently we had talked with Sasha Urich and on the podcast, and he cued me off to this document. He mentioned this, and this was the library guidelines. And in the anti-patterns section, I love it. It says, avoid macros. And then it says, to quote from the official guide on macros, and like just quoting the last ending paragraph or the last sentence of it says, remember that explicit is better than implicit. Clear code is better than concise code. And I completely agree with that. And so, yes, and I feel like you can do that with Elixir. You can just by using a function and passing in an anonymous function as an argument. So like it looks in Ruby a lot like a block. Just doing patterns like that, I can do a lot of stuff that feels like a macro, but I can totally follow it all. And there's no magic.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I've actually never written a macro on my own. We did a small amount of really controlled macro stuff on the MBTA, and I've worked with some of that code, and it was okay to work with. Nothing wrong with it. But you really should think twice before you dive into macros, because it's usually for your own intellectual curiosity, not because it makes better code.
I did something with macros one time to sort of enforce return value types that absolutely should have just been, hey, use dialyzer.
So, Bill, you'd mentioned prior to the show, we were talking about dialyzer a little bit. And so what are your feelings on dialyzer? Like, is that a good thing, a bad thing? Where do you kind of feel?
In concept, I love dialyzer. I'm a big proponent of the Elm language. It's my first time really diving into a super strongly typed language, and I love it. I think it's the wave of the future where we should be going.
Woo-woo.
And we use dialyzer really heavily at the MBTA. And it's awesome in a way. It does find a lot of those problems you wouldn't find. And the biggest thing I found at the MBTA where everything ran through dialyzer was when I dove into legacy code, I had the types there. And the types were often really, really complex. And if I hadn't had those type definitions, it would have taken me hours to unwind. What is this function doing? What does it really return? So I found that dialyzer really worked best because it enforced you actually putting your type specs in place.
One thing I wanted to mention about dialyzer, just because this is new to me. So I'm trying out VS Code, and anyone that knows me knows I'm a Vim zealot, so this is a big deal. And it does incremental dialyzer compilation. So it'll just check the module you've changed, which is like really fast, and it's super nice. You can actually use dialyzer the way that you would use TypeScript checks in the IDE, for instance. And it's just very good. And it even suggests specs. So you can just click to add a spec and then tweak it.
Oh, nice. Yeah, the problem with dialyzer is, of course, the error messages. Trying to unwind the error message and see what's really wrong can take a lot of effort and time and be horribly frustrating. And I think
the interesting thing, though, is if there's an error message, like, there is a problem.
Exactly. And I tried to convince myself many times, probably not really a problem because I can't figure it out. And then eventually I'd figure it out. So on my current project, I started off like, I'm going to go dialyzer front to back. But this is kind of a different project than I'm used to. It's a startup. We're trying to get to an MVP very, very quickly. So about a month into the project, I stopped writing new specs, was still running dialyzer because I thought I didn't have time. And then at some point, I'm like, I haven't written a spec in a long time. Dialyzer hasn't found anything in a long time. Let's turn it off to make CI run faster. And of course, 3 weeks later, I have a 500 error on the server. I spent some time debugging it. And it turns out I was returning a different type from, there was a if then else sort of thing with 3 possible conditions. 2 were returning one type. The third was returning a different type. The controller was expecting one of them and it blew up. And, it was definitely a test problem on my part. I missed some tests, but dialyzer would have caught that instantly. So I'm back to saying I should go back, turn dialyzer back on and start filling in type specs because it will gain me something. There's probably other time bombs in my code I don't know about that dialyzer would find for me.
Yeah, you should. I don't want to say you should, but I encourage people to check out the VS Code Elixir LS plugin because it makes dialyzer way more powerful just because it's actually fast. And that's never been a thing I said about dialyzer.
Yeah, I've never found dialyzer bad because of the way it caches things. When I'm running from the command line, I find it runs pretty quickly most of the time. On CI, where there's nothing cached, it takes 10 minutes on this fairly small project. But speed was never the problem. It was always just when it fails, how do I debug these error messages? And I think part of that is being spoiled by Elm's error messages and expecting the world to be like that.
Yeah, well, the next release of diElixir also is going to have at least Elixir focus messages, or maybe it's the current release. Anyway, but there's an Elixir output mode.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's we had him on the we talked about that on the previous episode, and I played with it and I've used it, and yeah, so it's an RC right now, but it's really been helpful because there's an explain function of the dialyzer where you can say explain what this error means, and then it gave me an example. It's like, oh, okay, that's what it's talking about. I still didn't know how to fix it, but but yeah, it's so in some cases it's well, I know that's not actually a bad thing, so maybe I can just tell it to ignore that one.
Yeah, I think using dialyzer or any type checker in general ends up encouraging you to write simpler code because you see a dialyzer error and you're like, oh, this could return nil or this or this or this. Why is it that complicated? What can I do to make it not return all those things and hopefully not include the nil possibility? So I think that's one of those things when you see things that are, the type specs are that complicated, you're probably doing something wrong and you can probably clean things up and make a simpler type that encompasses all that.
Yeah, I agree. That's the best result is when you look at your spec and you're like, no, this can't be right.
Yeah, I think for me, coming from an Elm background where you have, custom/union types, you get used to thinking that way, where a type doesn't have to be a bunch of primitives. It can be something higher level. And even though you can't represent that in a simple way in Elixir, you can still think that way and say, here are the end possibilities. How do I make those possibilities as simple as possible?
I do like the idea of having Dialyzer actually be active, though. Like, maybe not necessarily that it fails the CI build, but like it regularly is like showing you the problems of the code that's being submitted. Just because like I've totally run into the case where someone puts a spec on a function and it's a complete lie. And I can see it, it's like, I can see this thing is returning this or this or this. But they're saying it's just returning a keyword list. It's like, it just makes me angry.
Yeah, I would love the day when Elixir and Dialyzer runs the way the Elm compiler does. You can get feedback in seconds. So every time I save my file, I'm running Dialyzer. That would be my dream world, where
that
it really is
what that
interactive.
plugin does for you.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to try that out.
Josh, how does it do it?
Using the language server protocol and Elixir LS, and also magic.
Lots of magic. What is Elixir LS?
It is a language server implementation for Elixir. But there is another one called like Elixir Sense, but it's not. It doesn't follow the language server protocol. So language server is a protocol that Microsoft introduced for processes to speak to an editor so that we wouldn't have the problem of, it's best to edit TypeScript in this particular editor because its plugin is best, right? And so you build one language server that provides all the auto-completion and introspection and documentation generation for symbols in code. And then each editor just has a client for a language server. And then all of a sudden, you build a language server and all the editors can support all the features you just made. And it's really good. And it is the probably best thing that VS Code sort of introduced.
I've been accustomed to using Atom as an editor. How have you liked Visual Studio Code?
It's a fantastic IDE. And as an editor, it's probably pretty good. But Vim is the best editor of all time in terms of text editing. And so, for instance, Vim mode... yeah, that's not fair, but opinions. But like in Vim mode, if I move too fast, like it just some commands don't get sent down to the Vim mode buffer or something. So like if I go to the beginning of a line in insert mode, then hit escape and then hit a letter, I'll still be in insert mode when I hit the letter sometimes, and it's infuriating. But the extremely simplistic integration with Elixir LS is worth it for me on Elixir projects, and it's also fantastic on Flutter, if you care about that sort of thing.
I have played with Flutter. Yes.
It's really awesome.
So I've been using it for Ruby, JavaScript, and Elixir, and I've been super happy with it. Of course, I used to be a hardcore Emacs user, and so the Emacs bindings are pretty awesome. So it's just because you get into the weird modes in Vim, that's why you have a problem, Josh.
Not even in a weird mode. It just doesn't change modes.
Yeah.
Anyway, it only happens about 10% of the time, which is just enough to be infuriating.
I think it's definitely worth checking out, though. It's definitely the editor I use nowadays because it has some of the power that I missed in an editor that I liked having automatically in an IDE. But the flip side of it was that it's all pretty low key, and you're not overwhelmed with everything that's going on there, and you can just pull in the plugins that you want. So,
Bill, what editor do you favor?
I'm a Vim person. I've been holding out on VS Code, although I see people who I never thought would switch from Vim to VS Code doing it. So I know it's legit, and maybe someday I'll do it, but still pretty hardcore Tmux Vim myself.
So there is a language server integration in Vim. So if you play with it, I'd love to hear about it. You get all the Dialyzer goodies from VS Code's plugin, except for the incremental compilation.
Yeah, I haven't tried that yet. That's something worth trying.
Can you tell I've been nerding out about this stuff this week?
You give me some stuff to play with too.
Yeah, try it. You'll like it. If you've been using Atom, I think there's an Atom plugin too. So if you're used to those key bindings, you can pull that in. Well, and Atom is built by GitHub, which is being acquired by Microsoft. So
I know. And now you have these two competing things, and they're both I think Visual Studio Code's also open source.
They're both open source. Yep.
Yes. So I kind of imagine that one of them is going to win out in the end. I hate the name Visual Studio Code. It's a stupid name.
Well, I should also mention, if you do run VS Code, there's a version of it called VS Codium that's just like the Chromium versus Chrome.
Oh, nice.
And so it doesn't have the Microsoft telemetry. Like there's stuff in the binary that Microsoft releases that you just can't turn off. It's not the open source release precisely. So yeah, use VS Codium.
Nice tip. So Bill, I did have coming back to some of the other things we were going to talk about. I know you have some feelings on GraphQL. I also have feelings on GraphQL. What are yours?
It is true love in every sense. I haven't done anything production worthy with GraphQL yet, but I spent, one day on vacation because I'm the kind of fun guy that plays with GraphQL on vacation when I'm on a lake in Maine because I'm that crazy. And I was able to take the application I was working on, create a branch, and build out maybe 80% of the API in GraphQL in half a day. And I was like, wow, this is amazing because first I give capabilities to the front end people they don't have. They can cherry pick what fields they want. They can bring in, hierarchies I didn't envision them bringing in. So it makes their life easier. And from the back end point of view, my controllers go away and my serializers go away. And I'm building some fairly simple resolvers that are using functionality I've already built in my contexts. So it's one of those rare technologies that makes everyone's life easier. The front end people consuming it, their life gets better. And me as a back-end person writing the code, my life gets easier. It seems like it's too good to be true.
I've really enjoyed it too. I've been helping a friend who's kind of newer to the development of a GraphQL system. And one of the problems he's kind of having is just the idea that, I don't know, you saw this with SOAP a lot, where if there's an error in a mutation, that it will return a 200 status code response still. But the body of it will say, oh, there were errors. And I was kind of explaining to him, it's like, well, with GraphQL, you can actually, in one query statement or one post, you can say, run this mutation and this mutation and this mutation and run this query. And it'll give you all of those back. And one of them may fail, but the rest of them will return data. And so it is kind of like, I see that a lot, that people kind of, they get a little bit hung up on that part.
Yeah, I'll admit that's the side I haven't played with yet. I built out the query side, have not built out the mutation side, so I haven't had much experience there. But I just think, I played years ago with the GraphQL interface that GitHub had built out and looked really encouraging, really cool. Always assumed it'll be really, really hard to build one of these things. Mm-hmm. But the absence library is just amazing. And having GraphQL there to help debug your queries as you write them is kind of otherworldly.
Oh yeah, and then it makes it so you have a discoverable API where someone else on the team is building out some piece of an API, and I can just actually look at the schema in the GraphQL, graphical interface, and kind of explore the schema and say, oh, these are the mutations I have available. Yeah, so I don't have to go dig into the code necessarily.
I was just going to say, also, the docs are just never wrong. They can't ever be wrong about, they could technically return the wrong thing, but no, the docs are right, and that's a huge problem. I just did a horrible legacy API integration. The docs just lie everywhere.
Yeah, I've been trying to get around that in my REST API by using Bureaucrat, which is kind of nice in that you just drive your tests into Bureaucrat, your controller level tests, and they produce documentation. And it's decent documentation, a little bit, it's depending on how good your tests are. And that's been useful, but it's just kind of verbose and hard to read versus when you can, like you said, explore GraphQL yourself and figure out just what you need versus looking at this giant piece of documentation and finding the one attribute you're looking for.
Yeah, I feel like the GraphQL docs are composable in whatever sense that makes sense for docs.
So I feel like we've talked about a whole bunch of things. What are you working on now, Bill, and what are you struggling with?
See, I'm working on this TradeHounds tool and struggling with just bringing new stuff in almost every day. Today, my struggles change from day to day. None of them are horrible. None of them are super, super hard. But today I'm trying to learn how to send native notifications to a React Native application using Elixir and, using Elixir and the AWS SNS service. Nothing breathtaking hard there, just a matter of slogging through it, figuring out what goes on and how to integrate it with your rest of your code. That's been the fun of this project, is there's been a lot of new things for me, a lot of new AWS stuff, a lot of new deployment stuff, a lot of new technologies, and a pretty tight time schedule. So we're just kind of flying through things, getting things done, and learning new stuff along the way.
One of the questions I get asked a lot by a lot of people across the programming community is essentially, what do I learn next? So are you basically moving through these things as you need them? Or are there other things that you're going after that
For the most part, I'm learning them as I need them. The one exception to that is GraphQL. GraphQL I really wanted to learn, so I learned that on the side. And we'd actually, had the intention of changing this project midstream to use GraphQL instead of REST. But then the schedule changed by a month and a half in the wrong direction, which made that goal go away. So we're continuing with REST, but I think we probably will eventually turn this thing into GraphQL because I think it'll just clean up the code and the front end so much. But for the most part, we just learn things as we go because none of them are big scary things conceptual that we have no idea if we can do that. For this case, we know we can send native notifications using Elixir. There's libraries out there. There's definitely proof of concept. So it's learning little things.
That makes sense. And generally, when people are asking me what they should learn, it's, go work on a project and learn what you have to know in order to do it, right? And so if you're hearing about a technology that you want to use, pull it in, and you're going to find that you need to learn a few other things at the same time.
Exactly. I try to learn things on side projects, and it's successful. I learn little things, but side projects never get done, and I usually bail out before I get to the really hard stuff. So when you get a real project that has to be done under a schedule, you have to dive into that hard stuff and finish it.
Awesome. Anything else you all want to dive into?
I think we've covered it.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks then.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Mark, do you have some picks for us?
Sure do. Kind of in the vein of deploying apps, one of the things that I use in my kind of development chain is a tool called DIRENV. I'll drop a link, but it's available on Mac and Linux. And what it does is in a terminal, as I change into a directory, it takes a dot file that's in the folder and says, I'm going to load up your environment settings with these environment variables that you're setting should be set for this folder. And then as you change out of that folder, it unloads them. So it's really handy, like especially when you're talking about Docker, building releases, and where you're loading a lot of things out of environment variables. So it's just, I can just put these in an environment variable, and just as I change in the directory and start my Elixir app, everything has the correct values. And so I like that one, DIRENV.
And add that to your global get ignores.
True.
Josh, what are your picks?
All right, so I have one, and it's a super easy pick. I didn't have to think at all. So I mentioned Flutter earlier. So I was playing with Flutter for the third time, but first real time this week. And there's a lot of stuff I miss from, say, Elm, but even just the type checking that it does gets me 40% of the way between JavaScript and Elm, and it turns out that's a huge deal. Anyway, so Flutter is a cross-platform mobile app development framework written in Dart from Google. And you can make, native feeling material or Apple apps. And I've built a fair number of mobile apps, and this is with 24 hours of work on the thing, it looks better than and is much more responsive than any other app I've built. It's as responsive as the native apps, but looks way better just because they package up the sort of core layout concepts for you. So app bar and floating action button, for instance, on the Google side. And it's just really well thought out. It's all imperative and does very much the sort of React-ish push state down kind of workflow. And it's just really, really good. So if you're building mobile apps and you want to check something else out than React Native for cross-platform apps, I'd try it.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard a little bit about Flutter. I think React Native Radio did an episode about it. So Fun stuff. I'm going to jump in with a few picks here myself. So one of the picks that I have is a book that I've been reading. It's called Extreme Ownership, and it's by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And yeah, they both have interesting names. They were both Navy SEALs and basically led SEAL teams in Iraq. And the thing that's interesting is they came back and they were thinking, okay, I'm going to retire. And then one or both of them had friends that essentially said, well, why don't you come speak about leadership to my company? And that kept happening to them, right? So they did a session, and a CEO of another company was there, and on and on and on. So anyway, it wound up working out for them so that they started this leadership training business, and they put all of their leadership lessons into a book called Extreme Ownership. And this has made a huge difference for me just over the last few days as I've been listening to this. I have a team meeting every week with my production team, and I just sat down and said, look, I haven't been good about, ownership and responsibility on my end. And I haven't been very good about, making sure that you take ownership and responsibility on your end. We're changing that. And it was interesting because they all responded positively to that. And so I think people want it from their leaders. You think that, people can just get by on things, but people take pride in what they do. And I feel like I wasn't giving them the opportunity to shine in the way that they could because of it. So anyway, if you're in leadership of any kind in the company you're in, and sometimes leadership isn't you're the team lead. Sometimes leadership is you're just kind of the person that winds up taking the lead under certain circumstances, right? You don't have an official role as a leader. But yeah, all of those things play into essentially how things work. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that of all the things that are going on, I mean, there may be extenuating circumstances to some of the things that don't work out the way that you want them to. But what I found is, at least in my case, I have put myself in the position to be under those extenuating circumstances when they occurred. I may not have been able to foresee them. I may not have been able to handle them at the, known how to handle them at the time. But it's my responsibility ultimately to be able to handle those, know what to do under those circumstances, and to prep my team to be able to do the same thing. So anyway, really, really enjoying that book. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave my pick there. Bill, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, the first one is the new version of Distillery, the documentation. If you've deployed with Distillery in the past, read the new documentation. It's kind of amazing and how complete it is, how well structured it is, and how much really cool stuff Paul Schoenfelder has put in place to help you out, especially the area dealing with Docker. He gives a lot of information about how to build Docker images. And I think somewhere, either in this documentation or elsewhere, there's really good information about how to automate deploys with AWS, which is something I have to get into, using CloudFormation and things like that. And he just covers a lot of that stuff, how it relates specifically to Elixir, which is really, really cool, and something that I don't find out there for the most part.
I will second the quality of the docs and all the work that Paul is putting into the new Distillery release.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I have to give a big thumbs up to almost everything in the open source community that Dockyard does with him and Chris McCord. It's just really amazing amount of stuff to help the community, and Dockyard's paying for it on their dollar, which is really, really cool. We're lucky to have them around to help out with things like that.
Nice. Bill, if people want to find you online, where do they go?
You can probably find me best on Twitter. I'm at Bill Peregoy, and that's where I usually respond most quickly to things.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us.
Thank you. It was fun.
All right, folks, we will wrap this up and we will be back next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.